This is Land of Havilah, Genesis 16. Abram's now 86 years old, Genesis 16:16, and he had no children, but God promised him an heir. God did not say who the mother would be, but Sarai is his only wife. Father, please open our eyes to the Scripture. Verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had a servant, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, "See now, Yahweh has restrained me from bearing. Please go into my servant. It may be that I will obtain children by her." Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Comment: Sarai has good intentions, suggesting that Abram should have children through Hagar, but she should be careful. There's a difference between our good intentions and what God intends. So we have to keep praying, "Not my will, but thine be done," Luke 22:42. We should seriously seek the guidance of the Lord before we make any big decisions. We shouldn't assume that our lovely thoughts and intentions correspond to the intentions of God. God's the torch that lights the way. The thing that seems good and right to us sometimes is not. In the Old Testament, it was frequently said that every man did what was right in his own eyes. But that wasn't a commendation of man. It was a condemnation of what man was doing. We're to live not by our lovely thoughts and intentions, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. But Sarai here is doing what's right in her own eyes, suggesting that Abram should take another wife. Maybe it was the will of God, but if Sarai inquired of the Lord about it, there's no record of it. Seemingly Sarai was only figuring how she could make the word of the Lord come to pass herself about Abram having descendants. She was trying to help the prophecy along a little bit. Verse 3. Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to Abram, her husband, to be his wife. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived. When she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Comment: Abram went in to Hagar as Sarai suggested. If Abram consulted the Lord on it, we have no record of it. How about we stop and pray before we make a big decision, such as before we decide to get married? Sarai didn't get pregnant all those years, yet Hagar got pregnant right away. Therefore, in verse 4, quote, her mistress was despised in her eyes, meaning Hagar despised Sarai, looked down on Sarai. Coming up, that won't go over well with Sarai. Verse 5. Sarai said to Abram, "This is your fault. I gave my servant into your bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, she despised me. May Yahweh judge between me and you." Comment: Sarai's angry about it all of a sudden. She's at least half right when she says this wrong is your fault. Apparently Abram did not seek the Lord on it. He's the one that had an exceptionally clear channel to God and didn't use it. But Sarai's got some nerve since it was her idea. But Abram is in charge. He was in control of marrying or not marrying. If Sarai made the initial mistake, Abram did run with it. It was like Adam and Eve. Eve came up with the idea, but Adam ran with it. Verse 6. But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your maid is in your hand. Do to her whatever is good in your eyes." Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her face. Comment: Sarai doesn't have the right to be harsh with Abram, and he doesn't have the right to put the solution on her like he's doing here. When there's marital conflict, it's time to seek the Lord and watch him solve the problem that seems to be so unsolvable. We can't just wave responsibility off to the other spouse. Each has to do his own responsibility. In the end, Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and in verse 6, Hagar fled into the dry and barren wilderness. Abram and Sarai didn't tell her to go. Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar in verse 6, and Hagar ran away of her own decision, and maybe it was a good decision since maybe Sarai was abusing her to the point that she couldn't stay. It says Sarai dealt harshly with her. Regarding Hagar, verse 7, Yahweh's angel found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, Sarah's servant, where did you come from? Where are you going?" She said, "I'm fleeing from the face of my mistress, Sarai." Yahweh's angel said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hands." Comment: in verse 7, Hagar came to an oasis which was on the route to Shur. Past Shur there was Egypt, so maybe Hagar is trying to get back home to Egypt. An angel visited Hagar at the oasis and gave her instructions. Finally, someone in this story is hearing from the Lord. Maybe all this was in accordance to the will of the Lord anyhow, but it sure helps to walk with the Lord step by step rather than taking 1,000 steps without consulting the Lord and finding ourselves in a mess. In verse 9, even when we find ourselves in a wilderness, the Lord knows what to do. The angel said, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." Verse 10. Yahweh's angel said to her, "I will greatly multiply your offspring, that they will not be counted for multitude." Yahweh's angel said to her, "Behold, you are with child and will bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has heard your affliction." Comment: We can gather that God knew all along that Abram would take Hagar as wife and that she would bear Ishmael, and God has already made plans for the boy. Even if it's been a while since we talked with God, He meets us where we are, and He has everything worked out already. In verse 10, the angel says God will greatly multiply Hagar's offspring. So God has plans for this son of hers that she had with Abram. Verse 11 says, Yahweh heard Hagar's affliction. Thus the name Ishmael, which means God hears. When we cry out in distress in a tangled and desperate situation, God hears. Verse 12, He'll be like a wild donkey among men. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He'll live opposed to all his brothers. Comment: Ishmael's going to be a character, but the prophecy refers to his descendants as much as to him, that there'll be wild donkeys among men, with their hand against every man, living opposed to their brothers. Arabs today trace their lineage to Ishmael. The Arab-Israeli conflict is maybe the oldest known conflict in the history of the world, being recently renewed with the return of the Israelites to the Promised Land in the 20th century. Verse 13, She called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her, You are a God who sees. For she said, Have I even stayed alive after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahairoi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Comment: Bir means well. Bir Lahairoi means well of the living one who sees me. It's a beautiful name, well of the living one who sees me. God sees us in our affliction. Quote, I have surely seen the affliction of my people. Exodus 3:7. God is the living one who sees us. Verse 15. Hagar bore a son for Abram. Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Comment: Abram's now 86. Genesis 17 is next at landofhavilah.net. This is the map of Genesis 16. This chapter doesn't say exactly where Abram was at the time, but we saw him last at Oaks of Mamre. Mamre was the name of one of his neighbors, Genesis 14:13. Oaks of Mamre became Hebron, Genesis 13:18, and Hebron is still the name of the place in modern times, which is in the south of Israel. Hagar took baby Ishmael and fled in the direction of Shur, which is in the direction of Egypt. Hagar stopped by a fountain on the way to Shur, and to her surprise, an angel spoke to her there. The fountain was between Kadesh and Bered. If we zoom in on the area, it looks like absolutely barren country. She called the fountain Bir Lahairoi, meaning well of the living one who sees me. Genesis 17 is next.